Dave Mitchell pushed his maintenance cart through the corridors of Seattle Fire Department Station 19, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished floor. At 52, he had perfected the art of being invisible. His gray hair was always neatly combed, his blue janitor's uniform was clean but worn, and his brown eyes held a weariness that made people look right through him. "Hey, Dave!" called out Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old firefighter lounging in the break room. "The coffee machine is acting up again. Think you can work your magic on it?" Dave nodded without speaking, setting down his mop to examine the expensive espresso machine that the firefighters had bought with their own money. As he worked, the conversation around him continued as if he wasn't there. "I'm telling you, Stevens is the best captain this station has ever had," Jake said to his colleague Mike Torres. "Did you see how he handled that warehouse fire last week? Pure leadership." Captain Brad Stevens, 35 years old and blessed with the kind of confidence that came from never being told he couldn't do something, walked into the break room at that moment. His uniform was crisp, his black hair perfectly styled, and his smile had the practiced charm of someone who knew how to work a room. "Gentlemen," Stevens said, acknowledging the firefighters with a nod before his eyes briefly passed over Dave as if he were part of the furniture. "Ready for another day of saving lives?" The group laughed appreciatively. Dave continued working on the coffee machine, his hands steady and sure. In 8 years of working at Station 19, he had learned every piece of equipment, every corner of the building, every personality quirk of the men and women who served here. But to them, he remained just the maintenance man. "Dave's got it handled, Captain," Jake said, gesturing toward the coffee machine. "Guy's like a wizard with broken stuff. Too bad that's all he's good for." More laughter. Dave's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his expression remained neutral. He finished his work on the machine, which began humming back to life. "Should be working fine now," Dave said quietly, gathering his tools. "Great, thanks," Stevens said absently, already turning his attention to the duty roster. "Oh, and Dave? The apparatus bay needs mopping. We've got an inspection this afternoon." Dave nodded and wheeled his cart toward the apparatus bay, where 3 red fire trucks sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. This was where the real firefighters worked, where lives were saved and heroes were made. He was just the man who cleaned up after them. As he began mopping around engine 19, Dave's eyes automatically assessed the equipment. The hoses were coiled correctly, but he noticed one of the coupling connections looked slightly loose. The ladder truck's stabilizer legs showed signs of hydraulic fluid leakage. The rescue truck's medical supplies were well organized, though he spotted an expired IV bag that someone had missed during inventory. Dave had developed these observational skills over many years, though not in the way his colleagues might expect. Before coming to Station 19, before 8 years of invisible service as a maintenance worker, Dave Mitchell had been someone else entirely. Captain David "Ghost" Mitchell, U.S. Army Special Operations, had spent 15 years conducting high-risk rescue operations in some of the world's most dangerous places. Mountain rescues in Afghanistan, hostage extractions in hostile territories, disaster relief operations where traditional forces couldn't operate. He had been trained to notice details that others missed, to assess risks and calculate probabilities in seconds, to remain calm when chaos erupted around him. But that life had ended 8 years ago in a cave system in Pakistan, where a rescue operation had gone catastrophically wrong. Dave's entire team, 6 of the best operators he had ever worked with, had died in a collapse that he had somehow survived. The guilt and trauma had broken something inside him that no amount of medals or commendations could fix. So Dave Mitchell had disappeared, and David the maintenance man had taken his place. It was a kind of penance, he supposed. A way to serve without leading, to help without being responsible for other people's lives. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had chosen to work in a fire station, surrounded by people whose job was to run toward danger. "Hey, janitor!" The voice belonged to Tommy Walsh, a cocky 26-year-old who had joined the department 6 months ago. "You missed a spot over here." Dave looked where Tommy was pointing. There was no spot. The floor was spotless. Tommy's friend snickered as Dave walked over and ran his mop across the already clean area. "Much better," Tommy said with a smirk. "Attention to detail. That's what separates the professionals from from the help." Dave said nothing, continuing his work as the firefighters prepared for their daily training drills. He watched them practice ladder raises and ventilation techniques, noting their form and efficiency with the automatic assessment of someone who understood tactical operations. Most of them were competent, but they had the overconfidence of people who had never faced truly desperate situations. Captain Stevens was calling out corrections and encouragement, clearly enjoying his role as leader and mentor. He was a good firefighter, Dave admitted to himself, but he had the soft edges of someone whose biggest challenges had come in predictable training environments rather than chaotic real-world emergencies. As Dave worked, he found himself remembering his old team. Sarah Chen, the best medic he had ever served with, who could stabilize trauma patients under enemy fire. Miguel Santos, a demolitions expert who could read structural weaknesses like other people read books. Jake Peterson, a communications specialist who could coordinate complex operations across multiple agencies. Amanda Foster, a mountaineering expert who could navigate terrain that would challenge mountain goats. And Marcus Rivera, his second-in-command, who had Dave's complete trust and had saved his life on 3 separate occasions. They had died because Dave had made a judgment call that put speed over caution. The Pakistani military had provided intelligence about a kidnapped aid worker being held in a cave complex, with a narrow window for rescue before the captors moved her to a more secure location. Dave had chosen to proceed despite concerns about the structural integrity of the caves, believing that the risk to the hostage outweighed the risk to his team. He had been wrong. The sound of the alarm bell snapped Dave back to the present. The firefighters immediately sprang into action, their casual conversation replaced by focused professionalism as they suited up and climbed aboard the trucks. "Vehicle accident on Interstate 5, Stevens announced over the radio. "Multiple cars involved, possible entrapment." Dave watched from the apparatus bay doorway as the trucks rolled out, their sirens wailing and lights flashing. In moments, the station was quiet, except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the soft whisper of Dave's mop across the floor. He had become an expert at being left behind. 2 hours later, the trucks returned from the highway accident. Dave could read the success in the firefighters' body language. The easy conversation, the satisfied looks, the way they moved with the confidence of people who had handled their business effectively. "Beautiful work out there," Captain Stevens announced as the crew gathered around Engine 19 for equipment checks. "Torres, that extraction you performed on the sedan was textbook. Walsh, good job on traffic control. Morrison, excellent coordination with the paramedics." Dave continued organizing maintenance supplies in his corner of the apparatus bay, listening as the team debriefed their operation. They had successfully extracted 2 victims from vehicles and provided medical support until advanced life support arrived. By all accounts, it had been a clean, professional response to a routine emergency. "Dave!" Stevens called out, noticing some scuff marks on the truck's chrome bumper. "We're going to need a full washdown on Engine 19 before we put it back in service. These trucks are the face of the department." "Yes, sir," Dave replied, setting aside his other tasks to get the cleaning supplies. As he filled a bucket with soapy water, he overheard Tommy Walsh talking to Jake Morrison near the equipment lockers. "I swear, that guy gives me the creeps sometimes," Tommy said, loud enough that he clearly didn't care if Dave heard. Just stands there watching everything we do, like he's judging our performance or something. He's harmless, Jake replied, though his tone suggested he found Dave's presence equally uncomfortable. Been here 8 years, never causes trouble, does his job. What more do you want? I want maintenance staff who know their place, Tommy shot back. Yesterday I caught him staring at me while I was checking the rescue equipment. Like, what does he know about life safety gear? Stick to mopping floors, you know? Dave continued washing the fire engine, his movements steady and methodical. He had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the years. The firefighters saw him as an outsider who didn't understand their world, someone whose presence was barely tolerated and whose opinions were never sought. If only they knew. As Dave worked, his trained eyes automatically assessed the equipment being cleaned and checked. The thermal imaging camera showed signs of calibration drift. Probably still functional, but not as precise as it could be. One of the self-contained breathing apparatus units had a regulator that was slightly out of specification. The hydraulic rescue tools needed minor adjustments to maintain optimal cutting force. These were the kinds of details that could matter in emergency situations. But Dave had learned years ago that pointing out such observations only earned him suspicious looks and dismissive comments about staying in his lane. Mitchell. Captain Stevens's voice cut through Dave's thoughts. When you're done with the truck, the station needs a deep clean. Commissioner's inspection is tomorrow, and I want this place spotless. Understood, Captain, Dave replied without looking up from his work. Stevens studied Dave for a moment, and Dave could feel the captain's eyes on him. You know, Mitchell, you've been here 8 years, never asked for advancement, never applied for firefighter positions. Don't you have any ambition? It was an unusual question from Stevens, who typically treated Dave as invisible furniture. Dave paused in his cleaning, considering his response. The truth was complicated, that he had once held responsibilities that made Stevens's captaincy seem small by comparison, that he had commanded operations involving dozens of personnel and millions of dollars in equipment, that he had made life and death decisions that affected international relations. I'm content with my work, Captain, Dave said finally. Someone has to keep the station running. Stevens nodded, apparently satisfied with this humble response. Good attitude. Knowing your limitations is important. As Stevens walked away, Dave felt the familiar sting of being dismissed and underestimated. But he also felt something else. A flicker of the old fire that had once driven him to excel in the most demanding profession imaginable. For just a moment, he allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be respected, to be trusted with important decisions, to be seen as competent and capable. Then he returned to washing the fire truck, pushing those memories back into the locked compartment of his mind where they belonged. Later that afternoon, Dave was cleaning the second-floor windows when he noticed unusual activity in the parking lot. A black sedan with government plates had pulled up next to Captain Stevens's personal vehicle, and 2 people in business suits were having what appeared to be an intense conversation with the captain. Dave couldn't hear the words, but he could read body language well enough to know that Stevens was being briefed on something serious. One of the suited individuals was pointing toward various parts of the city visible from the station's elevated position, while the other was showing Stevens photographs or documents from a manila folder. After 20 minutes, the government officials left, and Stevens returned to the station looking troubled. He gathered his senior firefighters, Morrison, Torres, and Walsh, in his office for what appeared to be a private meeting. Dave continued his window cleaning, but his mind was processing what he had observed. Government briefings at fire stations weren't unheard of, but they were unusual enough to suggest something significant was developing. The pointing toward different parts of the city suggested geographical concerns, possibly related to specific buildings or districts. The serious expressions on everyone's faces indicated that whatever was being discussed involved genuine risk. As he worked, Dave found his training reasserting itself. He began mentally cataloging the resources available at Station 19, assessing response capabilities, considering contingencies and backup plans. It was automatic behavior, learned through years of mission planning, even though he had no official role in whatever operation might be developing. When the office meeting broke up an hour later, the firefighters who emerged looked grim and focused. Stevens immediately began making phone calls, while Morrison and Torres started pulling equipment lists and checking communication systems. "Dave!" Stevens called out as he passed through the apparatus bay. "I need you to stay late tonight. There might be some extended operations coming up, and we'll need the station fully operational." "Of course, Captain," Dave replied. "Anything specific I should focus on?" Stevens paused, as if debating how much to reveal to the maintenance worker. "Just make sure everything is in perfect working order. Equipment, communications, supplies. We might be operating at full capacity for the next few days." As Stevens hurried away to continue his preparations, Dave felt a familiar stirring in his chest. Whatever was coming, it was significant enough to put the entire station on alert. And despite his determination to remain invisible and uninvolved, Dave found himself hoping that his skills, his real skills, wouldn't be needed. Because if they were needed, it would mean that people were in serious danger. And Dave wasn't sure he could stand by and do nothing while lives hung in the balance. The ghost of his former self was beginning to stir, whether he wanted it to or not. The next morning brought an unusual tension to Station 19. Dave arrived at 5:30 a.m., as he had every day for 8 years, but immediately noticed the changes. Additional equipment had been staged in the apparatus bay overnight. Extra communication gear, specialized rescue tools, and medical supplies that weren't part of the station's normal inventory. Captain Stevens was already there, along with Battalion Chief Rodriguez, who rarely visited individual stations unless something significant was developing. They were huddled over tactical maps spread across a table, speaking in low, urgent tones. Dave began his morning routine, but his trained ears picked up fragments of their conversation. Structural assessments indicate evacuation routes would be primary concern is civilian population. Federal resources on standby. As Dave moved through the station with his cleaning cart, he noticed other details that confirmed his suspicions about the seriousness of the situation. The firefighters' personal gear had been pre-positioned near the trucks. Extra medical supplies had been staged in the rescue unit. The communication systems were being tested more frequently than usual. "Morning, Dave," Jake Morrison said as Dave entered the break room to clean. Jake looked tired, as if he hadn't slept well. "Coffee's already made. Figured we'd need extra caffeine today." "Thank you," Dave replied, noting the unusual courtesy. In 8 years, Morrison had rarely acknowledged Dave's existence beyond giving orders for cleaning tasks. "Hey, Dave," Morrison continued, surprising Dave with the question. "You've been here a long time. Ever see the department this wound up before?" Dave paused in his cleaning, considering his response. The truth was that he recognized the signs of pre-operation tension from his military days, the combination of anticipation, preparation, and controlled anxiety that preceded major missions. "Can't say that I have," Dave replied truthfully. "Seems like everyone's expecting something big." Morrison nodded, stirring his coffee absently. "Yeah, well, just hope we're ready for whatever it is." As the morning progressed, more personnel arrived at the station. Dave recognized some of them as firefighters from other units, along with individuals in civilian clothes who carried themselves with the bearing of federal agents or military personnel. The station was beginning to feel like a forward operating base rather than a routine firehouse. Around 10 a.m., Dave was cleaning the apparatus bay when he overheard a conversation that made him freeze in place. "The Cascade Mall complex presents the highest risk," one of the suited officials was saying to Captain Stevens. 8 stories, mixed residential and commercial, built in 1987 with construction standards that wouldn't meet current earthquake codes. "What's the timeline?" Stevens asked. "Intelligence suggests within the next 48 hours. We'll have continuous monitoring, but if it happens, response time will be critical. The building could undergo progressive collapse, and there are potentially 300 to 400 people inside at any given time." Dave's blood ran cold. He had seen enough structural collapses to know that they were among the most challenging and dangerous rescue scenarios possible. The window for survivor recovery was measured in hours, and the risks to rescue personnel were enormous. "What kind of support can we expect?" Stevens continued. "FEMA urban search and rescue teams are being positioned regionally, but initial response will fall to local departments. That's why we're briefing you now. Station 19 would be first on scene, and your actions in the first hour could determine how many lives are saved." Dave slowly resumed his cleaning, but his mind was racing. A potential building collapse with hundreds of victims would require precisely the kind of specialized skills he possessed: technical rescue in confined spaces, rapid victim assessment and extraction, coordination of complex multi-agency operations under extreme pressure. Skills that Dave Mitchell, maintenance worker, wasn't supposed to have. As the briefing continued, Dave found himself mentally cataloging the resources that would be needed: heavy lifting equipment for debris removal, specialized listening devices to locate survivors, structural engineers to assess stability, medical teams capable of treating crush injuries and traumatic amputations. The logistics alone would be staggering. "Captain Stevens," the federal official continued, "we need you to understand that this isn't a routine structure fire or vehicle accident. If this scenario develops, you'll be dealing with one of the most challenging urban rescue situations possible. Lives will depend on split-second decisions and flawless execution." Stevens nodded gravely. "My people are well-trained. We'll do everything possible." "I'm sure you will," the official replied, though Dave detected a note of concern in his voice. "But I want to be clear about the scale of what you might face. Urban collapse rescue requires specialized techniques that most fire departments don't train for regularly. If you encounter situations beyond your capabilities, don't hesitate to request additional resources." Dave wanted to laugh at the irony. Here he was, mopping floors while officials worried about the lack of specialized urban rescue expertise, when he had probably conducted more technical rescues than everyone else in the room combined. But Captain David "Ghost" Mitchell was officially dead, buried under 8 years of guilt and self-imposed exile. Dave, the maintenance man, had no credentials, no authority, no voice in these preparations. After the officials left, Station 19 settled into an uneasy routine of heightened readiness. The firefighters went through their normal training drills, but with extra intensity and focus. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Communication protocols were reviewed. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something they hoped would never come. Dave continued his work, but found himself paying closer attention to the preparations. He noticed inefficiencies in equipment staging, gaps in communication plans, assumptions about structural behavior that might not hold true under actual collapse conditions. Part of him wanted to speak up, to share insights that could save precious time when seconds mattered. But who would listen to the janitor? As the day wore on, Dave found himself thinking about his old team more than he had in months. Sarah Chen would have loved the medical challenge of treating victims in confined spaces. Miguel Santos could have provided crucial intelligence about structural weak points and collapse patterns. Marcus Rivera would have been invaluable for coordinating multiple rescue teams operating in dangerous conditions. They had died because Dave had pushed too hard, moved too fast, ignored warning signs in his eagerness to save one life. Now he was faced with the possibility of watching others make similar mistakes, potentially costing dozens or hundreds of lives, because he was too broken to step forward and help. That evening, as Dave prepared to leave the station, Captain Stevens called out to him, "Dave, I want you here early tomorrow. If things develop the way we think they might, we'll need the station running at peak efficiency." "I'll be here, Captain," Dave replied. Stevens studied him for a moment. "You know, in 8 years, you've never asked for time off, never called in sick, never caused any problems. That kind of reliability is rare these days." "Just trying to do my job," Dave said quietly. "Well, keep it up. Dependable people are worth their weight in gold, especially when everything else is falling apart." As Dave drove home to his small apartment, Stephen's words echoed in his mind. Dependable, reliable, worth his weight in gold when everything was falling apart. If only Stevens knew that Dave had built his entire former career on being dependable when everything was falling apart, literally and figuratively. But that was a different life, and Dave had made his choice 8 years ago to leave that world behind. Tomorrow, he would clean floors and organize supplies while others made the life and death decisions. Unless circumstances forced him to choose between maintaining his cover and watching people die unnecessarily, Dave tried not to think about which choice he would make, because he was afraid he already knew the answer. Dave's alarm went off at 4 a.m., but he was already awake. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, his mind cycling through rescue scenarios and contingency plans he hadn't thought about in years. The old tactical awareness was reasserting itself whether he wanted it to or not. He arrived at Station 19 to find the apparatus bay buzzing with activity. Additional equipment had been delivered overnight, and firefighters from other units were present for what appeared to be a final briefing. Captain Stevens looked like he hadn't slept either. "Dave, good," Stevens said when he spotted him. "I need you to make sure all the backup equipment is properly staged. We might be operating off this gear for extended periods." As Dave began organizing the additional supplies, he automatically assessed their capabilities and limitations. The extra rope rescue gear was adequate but not optimal for building collapse scenarios. The medical supplies were comprehensive but lacked some trauma care items that would be critical for crush injury victims. The communication equipment was standard fire department issue, not the specialized gear needed for coordinating complex multi-agency operations. At 7:23 a.m., the alarm bell shattered the morning routine. "All units respond to structural collapse, Cascade Mall Complex, 1247 Pine Street," the dispatch voice announced with professional calm that didn't quite hide the urgency. "Multiple casualties reported, building instability confirmed. This is a full assignment response." The transformation was immediate. The firefighters who had been joking and drinking coffee moments before became focused professionals, moving with practiced efficiency to their positions on the trucks. But Dave could see the tension in their movements, the slight hesitation that came from facing something beyond their normal experience. "Dave, you're in charge of the station," Captain Stevens called out as he climbed into the cab of Engine 19. "Monitor radio traffic and coordinate with incoming resources." Dave nodded, watching as the 3 fire trucks rolled out with sirens wailing. In moments, Station 19 was empty, except for him and the administrative staff who weren't part of the emergency response. But instead of returning to his cleaning duties, Dave found himself drawn to the radio console. He had monitored emergency radio traffic for years, but now he listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the tactical significance of every transmission. "Command, Engine 19 on scene. We have a partial collapse of the north wall, approximately 8 stories. Significant debris field blocking primary access routes. Copy, Engine 19. Ladder 7 and Rescue 1 are 2 minutes out. Battalion Chief Rodriguez is establishing command. Dave closed his eyes, visualizing the scene based on the radio traffic. The Cascade Mall was a mixed-use building he had driven past hundreds of times. Retail spaces on the lower floors, offices and apartments above. A north wall collapse would likely have created a debris cone extending into the parking area, with potential survivors trapped in void spaces throughout the structure. Command, this is Engine 19. Captain Stevens's voice crackled over the radio, and Dave could hear the stress beginning to show. We're going to need additional resources. The collapse is more extensive than initial reports indicated, requesting urban search and rescue teams and heavy equipment. Copy, Engine 19. FEMA resources are en route. ETA approximately 2 hours. Work with what you have until they arrive. 2 hours. Dave knew from bitter experience that 2 hours might as well be forever when people were trapped under tons of concrete and steel. The first hour after a collapse was critical. The so-called golden hour, when most recoverable survivors would still be alive. After that, survival rates dropped dramatically with each passing minute. Dave found himself pacing the apparatus bay, his hands clenched into fists as he listened to the increasingly urgent radio traffic. Command, we've got confirmed survivors in the debris field. I can hear voices, but we can't reach them with current equipment. Rescue 1, what do you need? Specialized cutting equipment, technical rope systems, and someone who knows structural collapse patterns. This is beyond our normal capabilities. Dave stopped pacing. Someone who knows structural collapse patterns. He had studied collapse behavior for years, had crawled through more unstable debris fields than he cared to remember. He knew how buildings failed, how to identify safe approach routes, how to locate void spaces where survivors might be found. Command, be advised that we have reports of additional victims on upper floors. The stairwells are blocked, and the elevator shafts are compromised. We need aerial access or alternative extraction routes. Aerial access. Dave knew that the department's ladder trucks could reach the upper floors, but positioning them safely near an unstable structure required expertise in structural assessment and risk calculation. One wrong decision could bring down additional sections of the building, killing both victims and rescuers. The radio traffic continued to paint a picture of mounting desperation. More survivors were being located, but the responding units lacked the specialized knowledge and equipment needed to reach them safely. Dave could hear the frustration in Captain Stevens's voice as he requested resources that wouldn't arrive in time to make a difference. Command, I'm going to attempt entry through the west side of the structure. It appears to be more stable than the collapse zone. Dave's blood went cold. The west side might look stable, but in his experience, secondary collapses often occurred when rescue personnel disturbed the delicate balance of partially failed structures. Stevens was about to lead his team into what could be a death trap. Dave grabbed the radio microphone before he could stop himself. Engine 19, this is Station 19 base, he transmitted. Be advised, west side entry presents significant secondary collapse risk. Recommend assessment of load-bearing elements before committing personnel. The radio went silent for several seconds. Dave realized he had just violated every protocol by offering tactical advice without authorization. But he also might have just saved lives. Station 19 base, identify yourself, came Captain Stevens's terse response. Dave hesitated. He could claim he was relaying information from another source, maintain his cover, and hope his warning would be heeded. Or he could step forward and take responsibility for what he had said. Engine 19, this is Dave Mitchell at Station 19 base. I have some experience with structural collapse situations. Another long silence. Dave could imagine the confusion on Stevens's face. The maintenance worker was offering tactical guidance during a major emergency. Mitchell, are you qualified to make technical rescue assessments? Dave looked around the empty station, at the maintenance cart and cleaning supplies that had defined his identity for 8 years. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. Affirmative, Captain. I have extensive experience in urban rescue operations. What's your recommendation? Dave closed his eyes, calling up knowledge he had tried to bury for nearly a decade. Recommend probing entry through the southeast corner. The column spacing in that section should provide better structural integrity. Use acoustic equipment to locate survivors before committing to specific approach routes. And Captain, establish continuous communication with entry teams. Secondary collapse indicators include dust falling from ceiling areas, creaking or groaning sounds, and new crack formation in walls or support columns. The radio crackled with static. Then Stevens's voice came back, calmer and more focused. Copy, Station 19 base. We're repositioning to the southeast approach. Maintain radio contact and continue providing technical guidance. Dave sank into a chair, realizing what he had just done. After 8 years of hiding, of maintaining his carefully constructed cover as an unremarkable maintenance worker, he had just revealed himself as someone with specialized knowledge of urban rescue operations. There was no going back now. But as he listened to the radio traffic and heard Stevens beginning to implement more systematic and safer approach techniques, Dave felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. The satisfaction of using his skills to save lives instead of feeling guilty about the lives he had failed to save. The first test of his decision came 20 minutes later. Station 19 base, this is Engine 19. We've located 3 survivors in a void space approximately 15 feet into the debris field. The space appears stable, but access requires removing several concrete slabs. What's the safest approach? Dave studied the building plans he had pulled from the station's files, overlaying his knowledge of collapse patterns and structural behavior. Engine 19, before disturbing any concrete slabs, shore up the void space with timber or pneumatic struts. The slabs might be providing critical support for upper debris. Remove material in reverse order of the collapse, last on, first off, and establish multiple escape routes for the entry team before beginning work. Copy. How do we determine the removal sequence? Dave paused, accessing memories of dozens of similar rescues. Look for fresh concrete dust, impact patterns, and the angle of fallen materials. The debris field will tell you the story of how the collapse occurred if you know how to read it. As the morning progressed, Dave found himself drawn deeper into the role of technical advisor. His guidance helped Stevens's team locate and successfully extract 5 survivors from the debris field. More importantly, his warnings about structural instability prevented what could have been a catastrophic secondary collapse when a section of the building showed signs of further failure. But with each successful rescue, Dave felt the weight of his hidden identity becoming harder to bear. He was operating at the edge of his knowledge while pretending to be something he wasn't. Eventually, someone would ask questions he couldn't answer without revealing the full truth about his background. That moment came sooner than expected. Station 19 base, Captain Stevens's voice came over the radio. We've got a complex extraction situation here. Multiple victims trapped in an elevator shaft, approximately 40 feet down. The shaft walls are unstable and standard rope rescue techniques aren't going to work. I need someone with technical expertise to guide us through this. Dave stared at the radio microphone, knowing that his next words would either save lives or destroy the careful anonymity he had maintained for 8 years. Engine 19, he said finally. I'm coming to the scene. Dave's drive to the Cascade Mall took 12 minutes through streets crowded with emergency vehicles and evacuated civilians. As he approached the scene, the scope of the disaster became clear. The 8-story building's north face had pancaked down onto itself, creating a debris field that extended nearly 100 feet into the parking lot. Emergency vehicles surrounded the perimeter, their red and blue lights painting the gray morning with urgent color. Dave parked his personal truck, a weathered Ford pickup that matched his unremarkable public image, and walked toward the command post. He was still wearing his blue maintenance uniform, and several police officers initially tried to redirect him away from the emergency scene until he explained he was responding to Captain Stevens's request. The incident command post was a controlled chaos of radio chatter, tactical displays, and personnel coordination. Battalion Chief Rodriguez was coordinating resources from multiple agencies, while Captain Stevens consulted with structural engineers who had just arrived from the city building department. Dave? Stevens looked genuinely surprised to see the maintenance worker approaching the command post. "What are you doing here?" "You requested technical expertise for the elevator shaft rescue," Dave replied calmly. "I thought I could help." Stevens exchanged glances with Chief Rodriguez, both men clearly uncertain how to handle this unusual situation. "Dave, I appreciate the radio guidance you've provided, but this is a complex technical rescue. We're dealing with unstable walls, confined space entry, and multiple trauma victims. This isn't maintenance work." Dave nodded, understanding their skepticism. In their shoes, he would have had the same reaction. But lives were at stake, and his 8-year commitment to invisibility couldn't override his deeper commitment to saving people who could still be saved. "Captain, may I ask what specific challenges you're facing with the elevator shaft?" Stevens consulted his notebook. "Shaft walls are compromised but not completely collapsed. We've confirmed 4 victims approximately 40 feet down, at least 2 with serious injuries. Standard rope rescue can get us down there, but we can't safely raise victims through 40 feet of unstable vertical space without risking further collapse." Dave closed his eyes, visualizing the scenario based on the building plans he had studied at the station. Elevator shafts were particularly dangerous in building collapses because they often became debris chutes, but they could also create relatively protected spaces for survivors. "Have you considered horizontal access?" he asked. "What do you mean?" Dave pointed toward the building's east wall. "Elevator shafts typically have access doors on every floor. If the east wall is structurally sound, you might be able to breach the shaft horizontally at ground level rather than entering from the top." One of the structural engineers, a woman in her 50s with dirt-stained clothes and intense eyes, looked up from her assessment charts. "That's actually not a bad idea. The east wall shows minimal damage, and horizontal entry would eliminate the vertical lift problem." Stevens stared at Dave with growing confusion. "How do you know about elevator shaft access protocols? That's pretty specialized knowledge for a maintenance worker." Dave felt the weight of 8 years of deception pressing down on him. Around the command post, emergency personnel were waiting for his response, while somewhere in that collapsed building, people were counting on decisions that couldn't be delayed for the sake of maintaining his cover story. "Captain," Dave said quietly, "I think we need to focus on the rescue right now. I can explain my background later." Chief Rodriguez, a veteran of 25 years who had seen enough emergencies to recognize competence regardless of its source, made the decision. "Stevens, if this man can help us save lives, we'll sort out the credentials afterwards. What do you recommend, Mitchell?" Dave felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as he shifted into operational mode. "We need to breach the east wall at ground level, approximately 10 feet from the elevator bank. But first, we have to shore up the shaft walls to prevent collapse during entry. The victims are probably on top of the elevator car, which means we'll need medical personnel ready for immediate trauma care." "How long will this take?" Rodriguez asked. 30 minutes for proper shoring, another 20 to breach the wall safely. Figure an hour total before we can begin victim extraction." Stevens was studying Dave with open amazement. "You're talking about this like you've done it before." Dave met his eyes steadily. I have. Before anyone could ask follow-up questions, Dave was already moving toward the building, his trained eyes assessing structural damage and identifying the safest approach routes. The transformation was remarkable. The quiet, unassuming maintenance worker had been replaced by someone who moved with confident purpose and tactical awareness. Jake Morrison, who had been coordinating equipment staging, jogged over to Stevens with a confused expression. "Captain, is that really Dave from the station? Because he just rattled off a list of specialized equipment we need, and it's stuff I've never even heard of." Stevens watched as Dave consulted with the structural engineers, pointing to specific areas of the building and sketching entry plans in the dirt. "I'm starting to think we don't know Dave as well as we thought we did." The breach operation proceeded exactly as Dave had outlined. Working with a team of firefighters who were increasingly impressed by his expertise, he supervised the installation of pneumatic shores to stabilize the elevator shaft walls. His directions were precise and confident, delivered with the calm authority of someone who had coordinated similar operations many times before. "Mitchell," Chief Rodriguez said as they prepared for the wall breach, "I've been in this business for 2.5 decades, and I've never seen a maintenance worker who knows structural rescue techniques like this. Where exactly did you learn these skills?" Dave paused in his work, realizing that the moment of full revelation was unavoidable. Around him, a dozen emergency personnel were waiting for his answer, while the sound of cutting torches and debris removal echoed from the breach point. "Chief, I spent 15 years in Army Special Operations conducting technical rescues. I was a team leader specializing in urban search and rescue in combat environments." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of emergency operations. Stevens, Morrison, Walsh, and the other firefighters who had treated Dave as invisible furniture for 8 years stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. "Special operations," Stevens finally managed. "You mean like hostage rescue, disaster response, technical extractions in denied areas," Dave confirmed. "I retired 8 years ago and took the maintenance position because I wanted to serve without having to make command decisions that could get people killed." Tommy Walsh, who had spent months treating Dave with casual contempt, looked like he had been punched in the stomach. "You mean all this time you were— Jesus, Dave, why didn't you say anything?" Dave's response was interrupted by a radio call from the breach team. "Command, we've got wall penetration. Visual contact with victims established, requesting medical personnel and extraction equipment." "Copy," Rodriguez responded, then turned back to Dave. "We'll finish this conversation later. Right now, I need you to coordinate this extraction. You seem to know what you're doing." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in technical rescue operations. Dave moved seamlessly between roles: structural advisor, tactical coordinator, and hands-on rescue technician. He guided the medical team through the complexities of treating trauma victims in confined spaces, coordinated the installation of hauling systems for victim extraction, and maintained constant awareness of structural conditions that could endanger the entire operation. The 4 elevator victims were successfully extracted with no further casualties among the rescue personnel. But Dave's involvement didn't end there. As word spread through the incident command structure about the maintenance worker with specialized rescue expertise, he found himself consulted on increasingly complex aspects of the overall operation. Mitchell, the FEMA urban search and rescue team leader, said when he arrived 2 hours after Dave had already coordinated 3 successful rescues. "I understand you've been providing technical guidance here. What's your assessment of the remaining search areas?" Dave consulted the building plans and structural damage reports that were now spread across a table at the command post. To the amazement of everyone watching, he had transformed from an invisible maintenance worker into the de facto technical advisor for a major disaster response. "The southwest quadrant shows the most promise for additional survivors," Dave explained, pointing to specific areas on the plans. "The column spacing and floor system in that section would have created larger void spaces during the collapse. But we need to approach from the south side. The western approach routes are undermined by utility tunnel failures. Captain Stevens, who had spent the morning watching Dave orchestrate rescues with skills that surpassed most specialist teams, finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Dave, if you had this level of expertise, why have you been mopping floors for 8 years? Dave was quiet for a long moment, watching as rescue teams implemented his recommendations with precision that spoke to the quality of his guidance. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weight of old pain that explained everything. Because the last time I led a rescue operation, my entire team died. 6 of the best people I ever worked with, gone because I made the wrong call under pressure. I came to Station 19 because I needed to serve without being responsible for other people's lives. The revelation settled over the command post like a blanket of understanding. Everyone present had faced situations where split-second decisions carried life and death consequences. They understood the burden of responsibility and the guilt that could follow when things went wrong. "How many people have you helped save today?" Chief Rodriguez asked quietly. Dave counted mentally. 11 confirmed extractions, plus the rescue teams whose lives were protected by proper safety protocols. "And how many people would have died if you had stayed at the station mopping floors?" Dave didn't answer, but the math was clear to everyone present. His expertise had been the difference between successful rescues and potential tragedy. As the afternoon wore on and additional specialized teams arrived to take over the more routine aspects of the operation, Dave found himself surrounded by emergency personnel who wanted to understand how someone with his capabilities had remained hidden in plain sight for 8 years. But the most significant conversation came from an unexpected source. "Mitchell?" The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, and Dave's blood went cold as he turned to see a woman in FEMA rescue gear approaching the command post. "Dave Mitchell? Is that really you?" Dave stared at the woman he had believed dead for 8 years, his carefully controlled composure finally cracking. "Sarah? But you were... How are you... alive?" She finished with a sad smile. "Barely. But we all survived, Dave. Marcus, Miguel, Amanda, Jake. We all made it out of those caves. You were the only one we couldn't find." The world seemed to tilt around Dave as 8 years of guilt and self-imposed exile suddenly shifted beneath him. His team hadn't died because of his decisions. They had survived, and he had disappeared before learning the truth. "We've been looking for you for 8 years, Sarah continued. "When we heard about a maintenance worker at a fire station who was providing expert technical rescue guidance, Marcus put it together. He's on his way here now." Dave sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that the foundation of his exile had been built on incomplete information. Around him, the emergency response continued, but his world had fundamentally changed in the space of a few sentences. "Dave," Captain Stevens said quietly, "I think you and I need to have a very long conversation when this is over." Dave nodded, but his attention was focused on Sarah Chen and the impossible fact that the people he had mourned for 8 years were alive. The carefully constructed walls of his new identity were crumbling, but for the first time in 8 years, he wasn't afraid of what might be revealed beneath them. The ghost of his former self wasn't a ghost at all. It was the person he had always been, temporarily lost, but never truly gone. The Cascade Mall rescue operation continued into the evening, but Dave found himself operating in a state of emotional shock that made every familiar task feel surreal. Sarah Chen worked alongside him with the easy competence of their old partnership, but neither had time to process the enormity of their reunion while lives still hung in the balance. "Dave, we need your assessment on the north stairwell," Chief Rodriguez called out as the rescue operation entered its 8th hour. "The FEMA team thinks there might be survivors. but they're concerned about structural stability. Dave nodded, forcing himself to focus on the immediate crisis while his mind reeled from Sarah's revelation. As he walked toward the damaged stairwell with Sarah beside him, 8 years of separation seemed to compress into moments. How? He asked quietly as they studied the debris-choked stairwell entrance. The cave didn't collapse on us, Sarah replied, checking her equipment with the automatic precision he remembered. It collapsed behind us. We were trapped for 36 hours, but alive. When we finally got out, you were listed as missing in action. The official report said you had been caught in the initial collapse. Dave felt physically sick. I thought, all these years, I believed. That you had killed us with a bad decision, Sarah finished. Marcus figured out what you must be thinking. He spent 8 years trying to track you down, convinced you'd gone underground somewhere, blaming yourself for our deaths. They reached the stairwell, where FEMA team members were using acoustic equipment to listen for signs of life beneath tons of concrete and steel. Dave automatically shifted into assessment mode, studying the damage patterns and structural implications. There's a void space about 12 feet in, he told the FEMA team leader, but the approach route is unstable. We'll need to reinforce the ceiling before attempting entry. As they began setting up the necessary equipment, Sarah continued their conversation in the low tones of professionals working under pressure. What happened after Pakistan, Dave? Where did you go? I resigned my commission and disappeared, Dave replied, guiding a pneumatic shore into position. Changed my name? Took the maintenance job here? I needed to serve without being responsible for anyone else. For 8 years you've been cleaning floors because you thought we were dead? Dave nodded, unable to meet her eyes. I couldn't handle the thought of making another decision that might cost lives. It seemed safer to be invisible. Sarah was quiet for a moment as they worked to stabilize the stairwell approach. When she spoke again, her voice carried the gentle firmness he remembered from their military partnership. Dave, you saved 12 people today. Your expertise prevented what could have been multiple rescue team casualties. You coordinated 3 complex extractions that no one else here could have managed. How is that playing it safe? Before Dave could answer, the acoustic equipment registered positive contact. Somewhere beneath the debris, someone was still alive and trying to respond to the rescue team's signals. We've got survivors, the FEMA team leader announced. Looks like 2 people, possibly trapped in the stairwell landing between floors 3 and 4. Dave studied the structural assessment data, his mind automatically calculating approach routes and risk factors. The debris pile is too unstable for conventional entry. We'll need to approach from above, rappelling down the stairwell from the 4th floor. That's a 40-foot rappel through unstable debris, one of the FEMA technicians pointed out. High risk for the rescue personnel. Dave was already moving toward the equipment cache. I'll take the lead. Sarah, I need you coordinating the hall system from above. Dave? Sarah caught his arm as he prepared his rappelling gear. You don't have to prove anything. We have qualified people who can handle this. Dave met her eyes for the first time since her revelation. This isn't about proving anything. It's about doing what needs to be done with the skills I have. That's what you taught me 8 years ago. Sarah smiled, and for a moment, Dave saw the young combat medic who had saved his life on multiple occasions. All right, Ghost. Let's go save some people. The nickname hit Dave like a physical blow. He hadn't heard his old call sign in 8 years, and hearing it from Sarah brought back a flood of memories from their partnership in the world's most dangerous places. The stairwell descent took 45 minutes of careful progress through unstable debris. Dave found the survivors, an elderly man and a teenage girl, trapped in a small void space created by a fallen concrete beam. Both were injured but conscious, and Dave's assessment indicated they could be moved safely with proper medical support. "Sarah, I need trauma supplies lowered down," Dave called up the stairwell. "The gentleman has possible internal injuries, and the girl has a compound fracture of the left arm." The extraction process showcased the partnership that had made Dave and Sarah legendary in special operations circles. Sarah coordinated the complex rigging system from above, while Dave provided medical stabilization and victim preparation below. Their communication was seamless, built on years of working together in situations where precision meant the difference between success and catastrophe. "Patient 1 coming up," Dave called as the first victim was raised through the debris field. "Have trauma team standing by for immediate transport." As the evening rescue concluded successfully, Dave found himself surrounded by emergency personnel who wanted to understand how the maintenance worker had transformed into one of the most competent rescue coordinators they had ever witnessed. But the conversation Dave most needed to have was with Captain Stevens, who had watched 8 years of assumptions about his maintenance worker completely shattered in a single day. "Dave," Stevens said as the last rescue equipment was being packed away, "I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you several apologies. We've been treating you like a maintenance worker," Dave finished, "which is what I wanted you to do. I came to Station 19 because I needed to be invisible." Stevens looked at the rescue scene, where Dave's expertise had saved multiple lives. "Well, you're not invisible anymore. The question is, what happens now?" Dave looked around at the emergency personnel who were still processing the events of the day. Captain Stevens, who had discovered his maintenance worker was a decorated special operations veteran. Jake Morrison and Tommy Walsh, who had spent months treating Dave with casual contempt. Sarah Chen, whose survival had invalidated 8 years of guilt-driven exile. "I don't know," Dave admitted. "For 8 years, I've been David Mitchell, maintenance worker. Today, I remembered that I used to be someone else. Someone who saves lives," Stevens pointed out. "Someone with skills that could benefit a lot of people if you're willing to use them." As they talked, a black sedan pulled up to the incident perimeter. Dave watched as a familiar figure emerged from the passenger seat. Marcus Rivera, his former second-in-command, now wearing the uniform of a federal emergency management coordinator. Marcus scanned the rescue scene until his eyes found Dave, and the smile that spread across his weathered features was like sunshine after 8 years of storm clouds. "Ghost?" Marcus called out, using the old call sign with obvious affection. "You magnificent bastard. We've been looking everywhere for you." Dave found himself embraced by the man he had thought dead for 8 years, surrounded by his old team members who had somehow survived the disaster that had destroyed his faith in his own judgment. "Marcus, I thought all of you." "We're dead, yeah, Sarah filled me in," Marcus replied, stepping back to study Dave's face. "You look terrible, by the way. 8 years of thinking you killed your team will do that to a man." Dave laughed despite himself, recognizing Marcus's irreverent humor that had sustained them through countless dangerous operations. "The question is," Marcus continued, "what are you going to do now that you know we're alive? Keep mopping floors, or remember who you really are?" Dave looked around at the faces watching him. His old team, the firefighters who had just learned their maintenance worker was a highly decorated veteran. The emergency personnel who had witnessed his expertise firsthand. For 8 years, he had defined himself by his failures and hidden from his capabilities. Today, he had remembered what it felt like to use his skills to save lives instead of mourning the lives he thought he had cost. "I think," Dave said slowly, "it's time to stop being invisible." Captain Stevens stepped forward, his expression serious but respectful. "Dave, I don't know what your plans are, but Station 19 could use someone with your expertise, not as a maintenance worker, but as someone who could train us to handle situations like this. Dave considered the offer, feeling the pull of old responsibilities and new possibilities. For the first time in 8 years, he was being offered a chance to use his real skills in service to others, without the crushing weight of believing he had failed the people who mattered most. "Let me think about it, Captain," Dave replied. "I've got some catching up to do with people I thought I'd never see again." As the emergency response wound down and personnel began departing the scene, Dave found himself walking with Sarah and Marcus toward their rental car. The conversation he was about to have would reshape everything he thought he knew about the past 8 years and determine who he would choose to be moving forward. The maintenance worker named David Mitchell was disappearing, replaced by someone who was ready to acknowledge both his failures and his capabilities. The ghost was becoming real again, and this time, he wouldn't let guilt prevent him from using his skills to save lives. The debriefing took place at a 24-hour diner 6 blocks from the disaster scene, chosen because it was public enough to feel safe but quiet enough for private conversation. Dave sat across from Sarah and Marcus in a worn vinyl booth, still wearing his maintenance uniform, but feeling like he was stepping out of a role he had played for too long. "Tell me everything," Dave said quietly. "What really happened in those caves?" Marcus pulled out a tablet and showed Dave photographs he had never seen. Images of the cave system after the collapse, rescue equipment, and most importantly, pictures of the team members he had believed dead. "The collapse happened exactly the way you calculated it would," Marcus began. "The structural weakness you identified was spot on, but instead of killing us, it created a sealed chamber that protected us from the main cave-in. We had air, water from underground seepage, and enough emergency supplies to last 36 hours. Sarah continued the story. "The Pakistani rescue teams reached us about 4 hours after the collapse, but by then you were already listed as missing. The official report said you had been in the forward section when it came down." Dave stared at the photos, trying to reconcile them with 8 years of guilt and self-recrimination. "But I made the wrong call. I pushed us into that cave system despite the structural warnings." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You made the right call with the information we had. The hostage was going to be moved within 6 hours. If we had waited for additional structural assessment, she would have been taken to a location we couldn't reach. Your decision saved her life." "And the structural collapse?" "Was caused by explosive charges the captors had set as a failsafe," Sarah explained. "We found the evidence during the post-operation investigation. They planned to bring down the caves if rescue was attempted. Your quick thinking got us into a protected area before the charges detonated." Dave felt the foundation of his guilt beginning to crumble. For 8 years, he had carried the weight of believing his leadership had killed his team. Now he was learning that his leadership had actually saved them. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. "We tried," Marcus said, "but you had already disappeared by the time we got out. Your resignation was processed while we were still in Pakistani military hospitals. By the time we were debriefed and cleared to travel, David Ghost Mitchell had officially ceased to exist." "We've been tracking you for 8 years," Sarah added. "Military records, civilian employment databases, even social media monitoring. Marcus was convinced you had gone underground somewhere, probably blaming yourself for what happened." Dave laughed bitterly. He was right. "The question is," Marcus said, "what are you going to do now that you know the truth?" Before Dave could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Stevens. "Dave, need to talk ASAP. Department brass want to meet with you tomorrow morning about today's operation." Dave showed the message to his teammates. "I think my cover is officially blown." "Good," Sarah said firmly. "You've wasted 8 years hiding skills that could have saved hundreds of lives. How many disasters happened in Seattle while you were mopping floors instead of coordinating rescue operations? The question stung because Dave had wondered the same thing. How many people had died in emergencies while he cleaned bathrooms and organized supply closets? It's not that simple, Dave protested. I'm not qualified to be a firefighter. I don't have the certifications, the training records, the official credentials. Marcus grinned. Actually, you do. We kept your military training records active through a Federal Reserve program. Technically, you're still qualified as a master instructor in urban search and rescue, technical rope operations, confined space rescue, and hazardous materials response. Dave stared at him. You've been maintaining my certifications for 8 years? We knew that eventually you'd remember who you really are, Sarah said. We wanted to make sure you could step back into that role when you were ready. The next morning, Dave found himself in the conference room at fire department headquarters, facing a panel of officials who were trying to understand how their maintenance worker had demonstrated expertise that surpassed their specialist teams. Chief Rodriguez conducted the meeting, with Captain Stevens and 2 deputy chiefs present. Also in attendance were representatives from FEMA and the State Emergency Management Agency. Mr. Mitchell, Chief Rodriguez began, your actions yesterday prevented what could have been multiple casualty situations. Your technical expertise enabled rescues that might not have been possible with our standard resources. We need to understand your background and discuss your future role with the department. Dave looked around the table at faces that reflected curiosity, respect, and administrative concern. These were people who needed to understand how the system had worked and how to incorporate his capabilities into their organizational structure. Chief, my name is David Mitchell, and until yesterday I was your maintenance worker, Dave began. But for 15 years before that, I was Captain David Mitchell, U.S. Army Special Operations, specializing in technical rescue operations in combat environments. He spent the next hour detailing his military background, the circumstances of his retirement, and his reasons for seeking anonymity at Station 19. The officials listened with growing amazement as Dave described operations that had been classified above their clearance levels. Why didn't you apply for a firefighter position when you joined the department? One of the deputy chiefs asked. Because I didn't want to be responsible for making decisions that could get people killed, Dave replied honestly. I had lost confidence in my judgment, and I thought it was safer to serve in a support role. Chief Rodriguez leaned forward. Mr. Mitchell, based on yesterday's performance, your judgment appears to be exceptionally sound. We'd like to offer you a position as a specialist instructor and tactical advisor. Dave considered the offer. For the first time in 8 years, he was being asked to use his real skills in an official capacity. But he also knew that accepting would mean leaving behind the anonymous safety he had constructed for himself. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course. But I want you to know that your expertise could benefit the entire region. We're facing more complex emergencies these days. Building collapses, industrial accidents, natural disasters that exceed our current capabilities. Having someone with your background could save hundreds of lives. That afternoon, Dave returned to Station 19 to find the atmosphere completely changed. The firefighters who had ignored or dismissed him for 8 years were now treating him with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made him uncomfortable. Dave, Jake Morrison said as Dave entered the apparatus bay, I owe you a huge apology. We've been treating you like I wanted to be treated, Dave interrupted. I chose to be invisible, Jake. That's not your fault. Tommy Walsh, who had been particularly dismissive of Dave over the years, approached with obvious discomfort. Dave, I said some things. You treated me exactly the way I presented myself, Dave replied. I was a maintenance worker who acted like a maintenance worker. You had no reason to think otherwise. But the conversation Dave needed most was with Captain Stevens, who had called him into his office for a private discussion. Dave, I've been thinking about yesterday, Stevens began. You saved lives with expertise I didn't even know existed. But you also put yourself at considerable risk coordinating those rescues without official authority or insurance coverage. Dave nodded. I couldn't stand by and watch people die when I had the skills to help. That's exactly the attitude we need in this department, Stevens said. But we need it in an official capacity with proper training and support. Will you consider the position Chief Rodriguez offered? Dave looked out the window at the city he had served quietly for 8 years. Somewhere out there, future emergencies would challenge responders who might not have the specialized skills needed to save everyone who could be saved. Captain, if I accept this position, things will change. I won't be the quiet maintenance worker anymore. I'll have opinions about training, equipment, operational procedures. I'll push for improvements that might make people uncomfortable. Stevens smiled. Dave, yesterday you saved 12 lives and prevented multiple rescue team casualties. If that comes with some opinions about how we do business, I think we can handle it. That evening, Dave met Sarah and Marcus at the same diner where they had begun reconstructing 8 years of lost history. So, Marcus asked, are you going to take the job? Dave looked at his teammates, the people whose supposed deaths had driven him into exile and whose revealed survival was calling him back to service. I think it's time, Dave said quietly. Time to stop hiding from who I am and start using my skills to help people again. Sarah smiled. Welcome back, Ghost. As Dave drove home that night, he reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in less than 48 hours. The maintenance worker who had arrived at work 2 days ago was disappearing, replaced by someone who was ready to acknowledge both his capabilities and his responsibilities. Tomorrow he would call Chief Rodriguez and accept the position. He would begin the process of stepping back into a role where his decisions would affect other people's lives. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But for the first time in 8 years, Dave Mitchell felt like he was moving towards something instead of running away from it. The ghost was becoming real, and this time he wouldn't let fear prevent him from saving the lives he was trained and equipped to save. The new training facility at Seattle Fire Department Station 19 buzzed with activity as firefighters from across the region gathered for the monthly technical rescue seminar. Dave Mitchell, now wearing the uniform of a fire department training specialist, stood before a group of 30 emergency responders who hung on his every word. Remember? Dave was saying as he demonstrated proper shoring techniques on a simulated building collapse. The debris field will tell you the story of how the collapse occurred if you know how to read it. Fresh concrete dust, impact patterns, the angle of fallen materials. These are all clues that can guide your approach and keep your team safe. In the audience, Captain Stevens watched with satisfaction as his former maintenance worker shared expertise that was already saving lives throughout the region. The transformation had been remarkable. But what impressed Stevens most was that Dave had retained his quiet humility even as he had stepped back into a leadership role. Jake Morrison, now one of Dave's most enthusiastic students, raised his hand. Instructor Mitchell, how do we balance speed with safety when we know there are survivors running out of time? Dave smiled at the question that got to the heart of tactical rescue operations. That's the central challenge, Jake. Speed without safety gets rescuers killed, which helps no one. Safety without urgency lets recoverable victims die. The key is systematic risk assessment that allows you to move as fast as safely possible. After the seminar ended, Dave was approached by Sarah Chen, who had accepted a position with the regional FEMA office, partly to work more closely with Dave's training program. "How does it feel?" she asked as they walked toward the parking lot. "Different," Dave admitted. "Good different, but different. For 8 years, I avoided making decisions that could affect other people's lives. Now I'm teaching people how to make those decisions better." "Any regrets about giving up the invisible life?" Dave considered the question as they reached his truck. No longer a weathered Ford pickup, but a department-issued vehicle equipped with emergency response gear. "Sometimes," he said honestly. There was a kind of peace in being overlooked, in having simple responsibilities with clear boundaries. But I think I was hiding from life rather than living it. Sarah nodded. "Marcus wants to know if you're ready for the next step." Dave raised an eyebrow. "What next step?" "Federal Task Force Coordinator. There's a position opening up that would put you in charge of coordinating specialized rescue resources across multiple states. Essentially, you'd be building the kind of rapid response capability that could have reached us 8 years ago." The offer was both tempting and terrifying. It represented a return to the kind of high-level responsibility Dave had fled from, but with the wisdom and experience that came from understanding both success and failure. "I'll think about it," Dave said. As Sarah drove away, Dave remained in the parking lot, looking back at Station 19 where his transformation had begun. The building looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but his relationship to it had changed completely. His phone buzzed with a text from Tommy Walsh, who was now one of his most dedicated students. "Dave, wanted to let you know the techniques you taught us last month just helped us save 3 people from a collapsed warehouse. Thank you for sharing your knowledge." Dave smiled as he read the message. This was what made the visibility worthwhile, knowing that his expertise was multiplying through the people he trained, creating a ripple effect of competence that could save lives long after he was gone. As he drove home, Dave reflected on the journey that had brought him from Captain David Ghost Mitchell to maintenance worker Dave to training specialist Mitchell. Each phase had taught him something important about service, responsibility, and the difference between hiding from failure and learning from it. The radio crackled with emergency traffic as a multi-vehicle accident was reported on the interstate. Dave listened to the familiar cadence of dispatch communications and response coordination, feeling the old stirring of adrenaline and professional interest. But this time, instead of feeling guilt or fear about getting involved, Dave felt satisfaction in knowing that the responders heading to that emergency had been trained with techniques that would help them save lives more effectively and safely. The ghost had become real. The maintenance worker had revealed his true nature, and the teacher had found his calling. It had taken 8 years and a building collapse to complete the journey, but David Mitchell was finally home. At his apartment that evening, Dave opened a letter that had arrived from the Pentagon. Inside was a commendation he had never received, recognition for the Pakistani cave operation that had ended his military career and begun his exile. The letter acknowledged that new evidence had revealed the true circumstances of the mission, including the captor's use of explosive charges to bring down the cave system. Captain David Mitchell was being posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for actions that had saved his team and successfully rescued the hostage. Posthumously, because officially, Captain David Mitchell had been presumed killed in the cave collapse. Dave laughed at the irony. He had spent 8 years believing himself responsible for his team's deaths, only to learn that he was officially dead himself, while they were all alive and thriving in new careers. He placed the commendation in a frame next to a photograph from the Cascade Mall rescue operation, where training specialist Dave Mitchell was shown coordinating the extraction of survivors from the elevator shaft. 2 different lives, 2 different identities, but the same person underneath, someone who used specialized skills to save lives in dangerous situations. The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. The caller ID showed Marcus Rivera. Ghost, Marcus said when Dave answered. I've got a proposition for you. There's a situation developing in California. Earthquake damage that's beyond local capabilities. They're asking for someone who can coordinate technical rescue operations across multiple agencies. Interested in a temporary deployment? Dave looked at the two photographs on his desk. Past and present, military and civilian, hidden and revealed. For the first time in 8 years, the decision was easy. When do we leave? He asked. As Dave packed his gear for deployment to California, he realized that he had finally found the balance he had been seeking. He could use his skills to save lives without being paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. He could lead operations without being crushed by the weight of responsibility. He could serve others without hiding from himself. The maintenance worker who had arrived at Station 19 8 years ago had been a broken man running from guilt and responsibility. The training specialist who was leaving for California was someone who understood that competence and humility could coexist, that leadership meant accepting both success and failure, and that true service sometimes meant stepping forward when others needed your expertise. Dave Mitchell, all of his identities and incarnations, was finally ready to save lives again. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.